Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Victor Peskin. I'm an associate professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. Welcome to our webinar. We are delighted to welcome Nnamdi Igbokwe, who is a postdoctoral fellow at ASU Institute for Humanities Research, who's physically on the East Coast, but is here in our ASU community virtually. And welcome, Nnamdi. And Nnamdi will be presenting his research on corruption today. And this is part of a three-part series that will start today, will continue on November 10th, starting at 4:30 p.m. It will also be an hour, and then will culminate on November 18th from 3 to 4, also here. So feel free to RSVP for those events. You can attend one, you can attend two, you can attend them all. They're standalone, but they also work together. Nnamdi is a political economist whose area of work sits within a tradition of international political economy with a focus on modernization and development economics. His research examines how development outcomes and conditions like corruption arrive at the intersection of international politics, state institutions, and global economic policy. And today he will speak on the title of Corruption in Context, a Question of Law or Normativity. So with that introduction, Nnamdi, please take it away. We're delighted to have you here in Arizona.
Thank you very much, Victor. I'm delighted to be there in Arizona while I'm here in New Jersey. So thank you for that intro. I'd like to also thank the School of Politics and Global Studies for hosting my series. Very excited to be with everyone today. And also thank you to the Institute for Humanities Research at Arizona State, where I'm completing my postdoctoral fellowship this year. And everyone else in the community that's taken the time out to join us this evening or this afternoon, or whatever your clock says, I'm happy that you're here. And I hope that you get something out of this. I'm hoping that this conversation, and I'm calling it a conversation purposefully, is informative. And I'd just like to briefly go through what's become very important to me, and that's my work on corruption. So with that being said, I'd like to welcome you to the first talk in the series, COVID and Corruption. As Victor alluded to, it's a three-part series, and I'm interrogating the political economy of corruption amidst COVID-19 and the pandemic, specifically with a look at the rise of institutional abuses of power. This first talk in the series is going to be focused on the definition of corruption, looking at contestations around how people define, typologize, the etymology behind the word, and what reflects behind the acts. The second part of the series is going to look at analysis and methodology, looking at the comparative view of how we assign different levels of corruption in either measurement or in other scholarly measures. And then part three is going to connect these dots, right? We're going to look at all the theoretical that we discussed in part 1 and 2, and look at the current realities of institutional abuses of power and how COVID has become an antecedent or a predicating cause of what we see today and across the world. So I'm going to look at instances in Africa and Nigeria, instances here in the United States, in Europe. But to get to that interesting, relevant part, I'd like to say, is first necessary that we look at corruption as a term and as an idea. So before I dive into what is corruption, I briefly want to talk about why it matters to me. And by the end of the series, I hope that maybe you'll have a little bit more relationship with corruption and it resonates a little bit more than it had before you joined me today. But there are really two moments in my life that have been the engine that has caused me to really pursue corruption studies and development economics and an academic platform. And I want to talk about those two briefly before we get into the talk itself. The first occurred as a child in Nigeria. So I am Nigerian. I was born and raised here, but I used to go back. I still go back quite often, but I would spend all of my summers there as a child growing up. And by summers, I mean literally from May to the day before school in September, sometimes the day after school. But that's a strong 4 months of just being in that country and being part of those people. So it's a huge part of my identity, and I'm very much attached to it. So I was about 8 years old, and it was one of our trips in Nigeria, and we were traveling late night from Lagos to Enugu. So Lagos is a big capital, not the capital city, so biggest city in Nigeria, and Enugu is a smaller, still large city on the other side of the country. It's akin to traveling maybe from New York City to Atlanta by road. So this is maybe 1992, 1991. At this time, there was a strong military presence as they ruled the country. Traveling late at night was very, very dangerous. And my family and I were traveling by road. I don't remember the reason why, but we were forced to. And in that travel, we had hired military security in the car with us. And I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was sitting in the back seat. We had a soldier who had a rifle, and the butt of the rifle was actually digging into my left knee the entire time. I was so terrified to move because my 8-year-old brain thought, if I move, the gun's going off. And I'm terrified, but at the same time, he's there to protect us and guard our passage, right? So along the way, we get stopped at a checkpoint. And I look outside and I just see a large man, very, very imposing, bangs on the window and says, "What do you have?" And then the soldier who's sitting in the car with us looks at us and says, "You have to pay him." So at this point, I'm very, very confused, right? Because we have a soldier in the car, but was paid to guard our passage. And simultaneously, we have a soldier outside the car that we now have to pay to allow our passage. And this is the kind of corruption that went on where you see and you're encountered with these moments in real ways. And as a child, that always stuck with me. And I still remember driving off in the distance and just being very confused as to how this happens. Spending part of my life in the United States, this doesn't occur at all, but in Nigeria, this is the norm. It's not only accepted, it's expected in some sense. So that was episode 1. Very, very young age. I had these questions about corruption. I had these questions about why, what does it mean? Fast forward 20 years or so. I'm now working on Wall Street. So I had a brief professional career before I went back to academia, but I'm working on Wall Street at a startup hedge fund. I come into the office one day and there are SEC officers, armed security, armed law enforcement, just collecting and gathering everything. And then again, I'm encountered with this moment of like fear and unknown. What's gonna happen? So our fund manager at the time says, "Everyone go home and I'll let you know. I'll be in contact." Now, to give you some context, this is a guy who would quote Gordon Gekko regularly. If you have any familiarity with Wall Street, the movie, the hyperbole that you see in Wolf of Wall Street and all those things is very real. It may not be that extreme, but it's very real. So he would play one of the theme songs from the soundtrack to Scarface every morning before the market opened. So we would sit there on our desk and he would play it on the big screen and kind of get us revved up for the day. So this is who we're dealing with. So after the SEC came in about 6-7 days later, we walk into the office. He sends us an email. We walk into the office and he says, "Come with me. We have a new office. The company has a new name. We have new machines. We have the same clients. We're doing the same business. But just like that, in the snap of a finger, in the blink of an eye, we're up and running again. Never to hear from the SEC again." And at this moment, I knew something was really wrong. Now, granted, during the course of my experience on Wall Street, you see a lot of questionable things, right? They call it channel checking or back channel checking or fact checking, or, we would get earnings calls before they were released, and all of these things that happen that you think happen actually do happen, but we think it's, business as usual. But this was something very, very different and very, very specific. And I immediately thought back to my moment as a child where I was confused again and had questions about activity that was clearly corrupt, but there were no answers. So again, on Wall Street, clearly corrupt, there were no answers. And there was a similarity that I saw in action and intention in terms of what was occurring, but a dissimilarity in perception. And this dichotomy really pushed me towards academia, pushed me towards scholarship on corruption, and led me to the work that I've done over the last few years. So with that, I asked the question, what do we really mean by corruption? Let's get started. On a very basic level, we can start and reduce corruption to a human perspective. That is very clear. Every civilization that you can think of, going back to the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Romans, there's biblical studies that will show the same. All civilizations had moments of corruption. Man's ego isn't to promote his own self-interest. That's clear. And that's not really what's at stake here, and that's not the contestation. What I'm looking at is something a little bit more structured, something more institutional that's largely political and largely economic. it's a sense of something that's established and ingrained, that's very procedural and embedded in society in a way that really transforms. So not so much hand-to-hand or social corruption, which is there and which trickles down and is a part of it, but more so on an institutional level, on a higher, broader plane, right? So that's really where the investigation begins. So if we think about definitions for corruption, the title of this talk is Law or Normativity. Now, in typical scholarly fashion, I'm not going to answer and define corruption, but I will tell you what corruption is not. So to start, corruption is not defined legally. And what I mean by that is that legality does not preclude corruption. You know, one scholar said the rule of law is simply not enough. So just because something is legal doesn't mean that it's not corrupt. Similarly, just because something is illegal doesn't mean that it's necessarily corrupt. And that continuum spans such long ranges within several different varied societies. But law and legality does not preclude corruption. And that's a confused assumption that's often made, that if I'm within the confines of the law, then I'm behaving righteously and this can't be wrong. Or if I'm doing something that's quote unquote illegal in the confines of the law, then I must be doing something wrong. But then you have to ask, who is writing these laws, who's creating them, are they similar across time and space, etc. So number one, corruption is not determined by legality, at least not always. Number two, corruption is non-normative. And I mean that there's no evaluative standard or behavior or behavioral outcomes. So you can't take the standard mode of behavior in one place or at one time, export it to another place or another time and say, yes, this is all the same, this is uniform. There's no homogeneity in corruption as a term and as behaviors and as practice. It's just so varied and so different depending on where you are and who you are and how you are. So those are the two broad things when I say law and normativity. Quickly, we can just dispel corruption is not based on legal and corruption is non-normative. To this point, there's a great example that I always like to share. Certain regions become demonized for certain acts as being more extreme, as being more endemic. And when you compare them to Western states or rich democracies or what we call the developed world, the acts look the same, but they're treated a lot differently. I'll explain. If you're familiar with political earmarking or pork barrel spending, as it's called in DC, you'll have a hint of what I'm getting at, but I'll get into it a little bit deeper. So pork barrel spending essentially is the reappropriation of funds for local projects. There's a bill that's passed. Local lawmakers will then earmark a portion of it for their local constituency in return for favor, votes, etc. Nothing seemingly wrong with this practice. There's a whole economy with lobbyists and consultants and interest groups that are built to secure these budgetary earmarks. So every day or every month or however many times Congress needs to propose a bill, you'll always hear there's too much pork in the bill or not enough pork barrel, whatever the case may be. But this occurs in the United States and in other places as just part of politics as usual, right? In Europe, they call it filling the plates or election sausage. The Serbians call it cutting the cake. The Czech Republic call it portioning the bear or cutting the bear. But it's called business as usual. It's just called politics. It's assumed to occur and it happens. But what happens when we travel from the United States and away from Eastern Europe or Western Europe, and we go to East Asia and we go to the Philippines? What happens when this type of earmarking occurs in the Philippines? Now, interestingly enough, in the Philippines, it's also called pork barrel spending or pork barrel politics. But when it's done in the Philippines, it's looked at as abusive, as endemic, and as violation of politics and economics. And it's called corruption. What happens when we go to Brazil? In Brazil, the same exact practices occur politically. The Brazilians call it jeitinho brasileiro, or the Brazilian way. You know, it's called pulling strings or just getting things done. But the rest of the world looks at Brazil and says, no, that's corrupt. And in Nigeria, certainly, any type of misappropriation or budgetary misallocation is looked at as simply corruption. Why? How can the same or at least very similar acts in different places elicit such a different response, right? How do we now differentiate politics as usual from flagrant corruption? How do we now parse out patronage and cultural benefaction from bribery and malfeasance? And here's where you start getting attention of what do we actually mean by corruption? So that's one example. But let's get into the definitions. What's most widely used? So Transparency International, which is the leading body on corruption studies, the World Bank, the IMF, any type of NGO or global body defines corruption very simply: the misuse of public office for private gain. Now, other definitions also invoke morality, a lack of integrity, dishonesty, the use of position for dishonesty. And these things feel accurate, and broadly they seem like they would be correct. But for scholarship and for really interrogating corruption, they're inadequate. Corruption, if you think about it, is real and illusory. It's simultaneously visible and invisible. You can see bribery when it happens. You can count the bank account and you can track spending and say, well, no, this is missing. That's obvious. But it's also clandestine because you get certain power reciprocities that don't involve transactionary money, that don't involve things that you can see or count, but that occur and are just as blatant and just as debilitating. So then how do you now contend with corruption? One scholar said that it's frustrating to write about something that everyone knows, no one dares acknowledge, and can rarely be proved. Another one said that corruption is the name that we apply to some people, sometimes, somewhere, in some context. Now that's some mouthful and doesn't really get us anywhere, but this is where corruption exists. It's one of these things that just becomes so diffuse and hard to pin down and really accept and understand what we're referring to. Other scholarship says that corruption has to violate public rules, or there's a loss or a standard of goodness, or a rent creation from controls, a rational choice of power position. So that is that, the saying that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So if you're in a position to enrich yourself, rationally you will do so. So these are some of the contestations around what corruption means. But if we try and typologize corruption, it falls into two categories in this sense, right? You have behavioral and you have institutional. Behavioral is a departure from a value system. But then you have to ask yourself, does that really equate to corruption? Now, let's pretend, or we don't even have to pretend, let's go back in history and examine that contention, that departure from a value system can equate corruption. What happens when you have a value system that is itself questionable, right? If you look at an abolitionist, let's say, the value system at the time was slavery. The actions at the time was to combat slavery and free those enslaved. Now, the system itself is called into question, but they're acting in a way that's in departure from this system. Would that make abolitionists corrupt? Okay, I would argue no, but then you have to go back to the root of the value system. That's an extreme example. I have another extreme example. If you've heard of the righteous among nations, so during the Holocaust, if you were non-Jewish and you helped aid the Jewish community or Jewish people to flee the persecution of the Nazis at the time, you were seen as a righteous among nations. Oskar Schindler is the most famous of these. Now, again, there's a value system, Nazism, called into question by your actions, helping Jews to escape. Are your actions then considered corrupt? It's in violation or in departure of that value system. Now, whether or not you and I agree on the merits of that system isn't really the question. It's that, can the baseline of a value system, and these are two extreme examples, so if you truncate that down into more simple examples, morality can sometimes be on a scale. Value systems can sometimes swing. So if you are in departure or violation of those systems, where does that land you in terms of being corrupt? So that's the behavioral aspect of corruption. institutionally, it's just as nuanced and just as troublesome. So Max Weber says that public office was historically regarded as a source of income to be exploited for rents, and only in modern times has the expectation of public office shifted. So if you were a senator in Rome, the expectation was you're in that position to enrich yourself and to put money in your pocket or power at your helm, right? Only in modern times do we expect politicians or public officials to act in a way contrary to that. But the definition that's working for contemporary studies anyway is the abuse of public position for private gain, which is in direct incongruence with what the traditional look at public office was, at least according to Max Weber, and others would agree. And this also introduces time as a factor. So if we're talking about ancient Rome, and then we're talking about, contemporary United States, how does time factor into what we consider corrupt and what we consider not corrupt? Samuel Huntington alluded to this when he said that 19th century America was very, very different, was appreciably more corrupt than 18th century and 20th century America. How can the same place oscillate and shift so extremely across 50 years, 100 years, what have you? In fact, if you think about America in the 18th century, they say that the polling stations, and it's apropos because we're now in voting season, so if you think about this, the polling stations were the sorcerer's workshop, where they turned money into whiskey and whiskey into votes. And if you know anything about that period of time in American history, this is where you have the political machine, Boss Tweed, Tammany, and you can only imagine how extreme that was a couple hundred years ago, but that was clearly corruption. But if you parallel it to politics now, maybe it's a little bit more veiled, maybe it's a little bit more clandestine, but what are these actions really representing? What do they mean, right? So you can't have a static definition for corruption and have fluid conditions. The two are incompatible. So corruption is varied and the meaning is varied depending on the political system in question and the political time in question. Again, making the study and the understanding of the term very, very dubious. I like to say that corruption is extremely steeped in subjectivity. And in so, it has become largely geo-specific. Again, that's certain areas of the world and certain areas and times are considered more or less corrupt or highly corrupt based solely on where they're located or the conditions that have animated their development. And there's some problems with that. There's another school of thought that says, corruption can either grease the wheels or sand the wheels for development, whereby the latter stagnates and the former facilitates. So if the state is the wheel and you have practices that are abusive or contrary to the expected behavior or corrupt, it can either help move things along or it can stop things completely. But is that then fair to take that term and have it be an umbrella over so many different varied actions and behaviors and call them all corrupt? To that end, let's explore a few terms to get to this point of how vastly different corruption can be and the understanding of corruption can be. So rent seeking, some of you might have heard the term rent seeking, basically awarding benefits from the extraction of profits or rents without contribution to production. Rent seeking is usually seen on a federal state level, a political level, but I like to give the example of, let's say you were an immigrant in the 1970s in downtown Manhattan, right? You wanted to open a pizza shop. You get all your money together, you open a pizza shop. But unfortunately, you've got local ruffians and, thugs, if you will, that come and try and either rob you or be aggressive and intimidate you. So a group comes together and says, you know what, we will offer you protection if you pay us every month or every week this amount to ensure that nothing happens to your business. And at that time, you would do that. If you were a pizza shop, a laundromat, any local business, you would pay for that protection. Now, it just so happens that those same ruffians that came out bothering and being violent and aggressive to you in the first place are part of the same organization offering the protection. But if you think about how that really violates and is abusive in terms of power and patron and client, then you can understand rent seeking in a more direct sense. Another term is embezzlement. Straightforward, most of you have heard it. Misappropriation of assets to oneself. Quick example is the Ponzi scheme. Everyone knows what happened many, many years ago, but basically rerouting money to oneself. But it harkens back to the discussion earlier about pork barrel spending when you're misappropriating funds. See, now that's called politics, but in some areas it's called embezzlement. Questions are there. The next term is cronyism. Very similar to nepotism, but it's with a close friendship or relationship. So it usually involves business people and the state, whether you get tax breaks or incentives, you get awards based on a relationship, not on merit. A good example is, let's pretend that you're the vice president of the United States and you also are closely tied to an oil company, and somehow magically, once you enter office, your company, let's just give it a fake name, Halliburton, rises to become the 7th largest military contracting company from the 22nd in a matter of 2 years. Maybe it says something about growth, or maybe it says something about position. I think it says something about cronyism. But again, these things are fluid depending on where you are and what you're looking at. And then the last term I want to just throw out there is clientelism, which is the structure of patronage that awards personal favors and contracts and licenses that's coordinated between business and government. My favorite example of this is Japan in the 1950s and 1960s. So after the war, Japan was decimated. And if you think about the auto industry specifically, it was almost non-existent in Japan, right? Toyota actually almost went bankrupt. They produced maybe 300 cars a year. And what the Japanese did was they enacted what they called keiretsu and zaibatsu, which is basically where the government insulates and incubates local businesses to remove competition and monopolize whatever the industry is to promote and detract from export, being dependent on exports. And they did this in the auto industry in Japan. And what happened was they became one of the biggest auto manufacturers in the world. So when we talk about the Japanese tigers in the 1990s and how the Japanese and Asian economies just shot up through the roof, a lot of that activity was due to government controlled and sponsored protection against competition. But when we do that in other areas, or we see that in other areas, it's just looked at as corruption. And it's interesting that you have Asian tigers, but you don't have any African lions. But a lot of these practices were very similar. It's just that the result in the end game was highly dissimilar. So when we think about corruption in this way, there's always a tendency just to think about the most ruthless dictator, pilfering the streets, driving in an armored tank, or a Russian oligarch, sitting, doing shots of vodka and counting his rubles. And that's fair. Those are very blatant and obvious modes of corruption and instances of corruption. But we should also think about corruption in a more nuanced way, and in a way that takes into consideration time and space and thinks about how we're actually defining it. Are there cultural norms at play? Are there historical features at play? Are there traditions or native practices at play that might vary or contrast your understanding of what's corrupt? I'll give a couple of examples of this to kind of hammer this point home. Something as basic and innocuous as tipping your server for a meal here in the United States. Common practice. You get good service, you leave a tip. Sometimes you get bad service, you leave a tip. But it's just what you do. But to the rest of the world, this can be very, very unusual and highly bizarre. Why would you pay for service by someone who's already been paid to serve you? Now, flip it for a second. What if you were forced to pay for a meal before you even sat down? So that same 15%, 20%, you come in, dinner for two, and they say, okay, well, give us $20 and then we'll seat you. You'd have a lot of questions. You might even get a little bit aggressive. Why are you trying to shake me down? Why do you want money? But in other places in the world, it's not uncommon to pay for access to your place of, wherever you're going to eat for dinner or what have you, and then still pay for the service after. So just by switching when you do the action, you start understanding how it can be called into question as corrupt, not corrupt. That's one example. But if we think about everyday institutions, and that's the point of some of these exercise and going through corruption's etymology and definitions, is we encounter or use or abuse power do you encounter institutions that use or abuse power to extract rent or profit? And I'll give an example of this. If you ever got a driving ticket or a speeding ticket and you get to court and an officer of the court says, well, you know what, we're going to downgrade it and you're only going to pay court costs. In your mind, great, I don't want points on my license, I'll pay court costs. Next violator comes in, we're going to downgrade your ticket and you're only going to pay court costs. Awesome, I'm on my way. And they do this to everyone, and they do this every day. And it almost makes you wonder, are they issuing tickets because people are violating rules? Or are they issuing tickets because you can just charge court costs? And in this sense, that's a form of corruption if you look at it broadly and not, well, that's just how the court operates. But how are they eliciting those violations? Is that a manner of seeking rents for something that may or may not be accurately determined? This is just an example and things to think about. Another one that I like to put in front of people is your energy bill. Here in New Jersey, it's PSE&G. I don't know what it is in Arizona, but sometimes they can't get to the meter and they have to estimate the use that they charge you. And if they estimate and overestimate and charge you more, obviously that's a problem. Now, sometimes they'll rectify it and they'll get to read the meter and make it right, but other times not so much. And now you're just being charged by what they think you're gonna do. Now, if you were charged everywhere by what you think was gonna happen, you would be in an uproar. If you pull up to McDonald's and say, I'd like a Big Mac, and they're like, well, we're gonna charge you for 3 Happy Meals because that's what we think you're gonna do. You're in a minivan. You would have a lot of questions. So it's taking it to an extreme, but it's also meant to point out how certain actions and certain things that happen every day institutionally can actually be called into question and thought of. If you export those to different areas, we're very quick and immediate to say corrupt, abusive, violation, but in our everyday world, it just seems like business as usual, right? Not to even talk about the legalization of alcohol earlier in American history, prohibition, and the legalization of marijuana. It's interesting that neither were legal until the government figured out a way to profit from it. I'll leave you to make your own judgments and conclusions, but these are just examples to show how corruption can exist in ways that we didn't always think were there or evident. I already talked about clientelism in Japan with their auto industry. Think about the United States, too big to fail. What does that even mean? Federal bailouts. If you fail, you fail. But if you're too big to fail, then taxpayers are now footing the bill for your abusive practices or being insolvent or not having capital requirements. And now it's left to the public to decide or to make up for that failure. I talked about defense spending. That's another example. These are just moments that make you really think critically about, when I say corruption and throw the term around, it doesn't always mean, a dictator who's sitting in his golden throne, driving his armored car, and there's poor people everywhere. It can mean a lot of different things at a lot of different times. I talked about pork barrel spending in the United States. At the time in the 19th century, the reason it was called pork barrel was because you would literally put barrels of salted pork in front of your establishment as a sign that you were affluent or well off. And those barrels, local legislators or politicians or civil servants would come by your establishment and be able to sample salted pork for free because you had it out there. And that's where they transported the term about going back and giving allocation and interest to your local constituency. But those things were very blatant in the 19th century in the United States. But if you think about super PACs in 2020, or if you think about how politics occurs, things are different, the terms are different, but the root of the action and the foundation of the practice and the behavior is still circling and orbiting around what we call corruption. So it's important to kind of keep these things in mind. And when I say all of this, I don't mean to exonerate the extreme behavior or chastise anyone who might just be doing things that they're not sure or they don't know is corrupt. But understand that when we talk about corruption, we're talking about a standard that we're giving things, and largely similar political and economic practices that are interpreted differently fall under a different name, even though the term applies very broadly and vary vastly. I like to say that corruption exists for scholars on a definitional wheel that we tend to start and stop where we see fit. You know, if it works for this context, corruption. If it doesn't work for this context, maybe not. So when that wheel starts and stops, it makes it easy, but it also makes it difficult to really settle the conversation and the debate about corruption. So speaking of starting and stopping, this is where I'll stop, and we'll open it up for some questions.
Okay, Nnamdi, thank you very much for a fascinating perspective on corruption and all its guises and manifestations. Very, very interesting. A lot to think about here. We will now welcome the floor to questions. And because this is a webinar, we're asking those who are attending in our audience, we have about 30 people, to pen your questions by typewriter. There's no such thing as typewriters anymore. I mean, at your laptop in the Q&A function. We have one question already. So I'll just pause to give people a moment or two to think of questions that you would like to ask Nnamdi, and then I will read them off or summarize them, and we can go from there. Thank you again. Okay, so let's see. We have one question. Okay, here's a question from one of our audience members. To what degree have you witnessed these examples of corruption in the Trump or Obama administrations? So that would apply, I'm thinking, to a range of different manifestations of corruption.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that you can go to any administration and any political regime and you will find instances of corruption. To answer that question specifically, I don't know, maybe if we go back to one of the definitions that I posed about cronyism, this is more nepotism. It's becoming president of the United States and then making your daughter a special advisor or your son-in-law with limited experience. Or, you know, my research actually goes into the intersectionality of politics and economics in terms of capital accumulation and political power. Now, it's usually found in developing countries. You see it in Brazil, you see it in Nigeria, you see it in Russia. You've even seen it in some places like Italy with Berlusconi, where the super rich are able to edge their way into politics and assume the role of top executive. I never assumed that I would see that in the United States. In fact, there's a line in my dissertation that says, imagine for a second if Bill Clinton, George Soros, who's a billionaire hedge fund manager, and General Petraeus were all the same person wielding the same power. Now, that's a little bit of what I saw in my studies in Nigeria, but if you take away the general aspect, you can see that the commander-in-chief now is at that intersection of politics and economics. To go a step further to the Obama administration, there's many people who think that the simple execution or deployment of something like Obamacare and something like forced healthcare is a means of abusing power and acting corruptly. And again, you can find instances over and over again. It's not exclusive to one party or one country or one person or one thing. Corruption is very vast, and that's why it's important when you're talking about corruption to be very specific in your context, in your time, and in your region, because it can really just spill over into everything.
Okay, thank you so much for that really interesting answer that puts the current 4 years and a previous 8 in a broader context. We have several other questions, delighted to see that. Here's one. As world societies continue to evolve and largely liberalize, what do you predict will be the future of corruption in developed and developing societies?
Okay, another good question. This is excellent. I'll point to something that happened a few years ago, the Arab Spring. Now, if you take the corruption metrics that existed and look at these countries that were involved in the spring, and looked at where they tracked as corrupt, they're always very low in the lower quartile. But after the Arab Spring, something very interesting happened. As it opened up, you actually saw increased corruption. And I think that's due to increased visibility, because now what was usually segmented off or cloaked off from the public eye was wide open, and corruption actually increased. So I think there is a parallel movement between development and corruption, but that happens naturally. You know, several scholars have spoken to this, that it shouldn't be surprising that as a country develops or goes through stages of development, even post, industrialization, let's say, you will have moments of corruption. It happened to the United States. Across 300, 400 years, you see moments of up and down corruption. Some are more blatant and flagrant, some are more cloaked and hidden, but they're there. So as development occurs, and as you have a reconfiguration of institutions, and as you have undefined roles in society in terms of who's brokering power and who's holding the mantle of power, you inherently will get more corruption. So that's how developed and developing countries will continue to increase. But then the important thing to remember is corruption is not always so starkly negative. Some countries developed on the back of corruption. It's just looking at it in a negative light is what we all tend to do. And I'm not arguing by any stretch that corruption is a good thing, not at all. But do we call it corruption, or do we just call it means of development? Do we call it corruption, or do we just call it modes of progress that have to happen? I don't know any country in the history of development that went through stages without being corrupt.
Interesting answer there. And okay, we have three others so far. What about asymmetries in salary and pay? For example, women paid less than men for the same job, etc. Does this constitute systemic corruption for corporate profit, or is this a different category?
Yeah, interesting. I think perspective would have a lot to play here. Most people would categorize this in the context of either equal rights for women or the misogyny that occurs in the workplace, or other things that go into this equilibrium of pay for men and women. But certainly, if you look at the system and the institution of it, there are certainly modes of behavior and channels of power that are continuing to suppress and condone this exact asymmetry. And I certainly would call it corrupt. Most people may not call it corrupt knee-jerk. They might call it other things. But institutionally, the framework itself, and that's what I was getting to at the start of the talk, is that corruption, in the way that I'm interrogating it, is something more foundational, endemic, structured, that continues to persist. And I would classify that as a form of corruption. But again, it would be blended and mixed, and then you get across disciplines, but corruption is largely interdisciplinary to begin with. So it will span sociology, economics, political science, anthropology, gender studies, all of these things. It cloaks them all. So it's a very interesting question. I think perspective has a lot to do with it. Maybe your discipline has a lot to do with it as well.
Okay. Thank you so much for that answer and engaging that really interesting and important question. Here is another question. Thank you for this, Nnamdi. I am deeply struck by your observation that corruption is steeped in subjectivity, that it's time and place based. Could you talk more about how this definition of corruption can help us look to the past and to history to make better political decisions as citizens?
Yeah, definitely steeped. Thank you for the question. Steeped in subjectivity, and that is inherently the issue, is when we make objective observations about something that's so subjective, you get a natural incongruence, right? So in terms of making better political decisions as citizens, I think it's just the perspective, right? If you are open enough, or at least aware enough to understand the manifestations of corruption and see that it can take place, and often does take place, right in front of you, then perhaps you will hold either political leaders or appointed leaders or elected officials a little bit more accountable, because you've become a little bit more specific about what they're doing and what they're pledging to do. So as citizens, the important part is to understand that politics isn't just politics as usual. It's not this cloud of behavior that no one can figure out or understand. These are human beings in positions of public power that are placed to work in our interests. And if they don't do that, even if it seems like they might be, it's for citizens to hold them accountable. So I would hope that this broader range of definitions for corruption, or this subjectivity, allows to kind of strip the objective nature of either institutions or politics and say, well, that's what elections are, or that is what, fill in the blank is. It's not always. And if you interrogate it that way, I think maybe you can move the needle a little bit in terms of what you expect and what you can actually achieve.
Okay, we have two more so far, at least. I appreciate the nuanced viewpoint on corruption you described, but I wanted to ask, under this framework, how do you recommend one objectively describe corruption while understanding the cultural nuances?
Great question, Ethan. And you can come back for lecture 2 and talk 2, because I'm going to get into exactly that. So if we can pin this question or just come on back, we're going to get into the discussion of methodology, of comparing, of different frameworks to understand corruption and then place it in a way that you can actually analyze occurrences and cultural nuance. So I love the question, but I don't want to step on my next talk. So let's just pause that one.
So on that one, that's the second talk, November 10th, 4:30 to 5:30 p.m.
Yes.
Okay, but okay, we still have more. Okay, I appreciate that. Here is another question. As someone who's worked in Afghanistan, I understand how corruption can be a normal part of doing business. How can U.S. policymakers better prepare themselves for corruption nuance in foreign policy development? And then I just want to add a question of my own, just in parentheses. If we have time to get to it, that's great. If not, I'm doing a research project related to Kosovo and U.S. foreign policy. And a question there is understanding the degree to which U.S. policymakers have scrutinized corruption in Kosovo or ignored it. And just a question about, because a corruption is often illusory, it can sometimes be something you can plausibly deny, either as an official in a certain country or as a foreign policy official. So that might relate to the question. No need to respond to mine. I can always speak to you another time. But again, just to preview the previous question, as someone who's worked in Afghanistan, I understand how corruption can be a normal part of doing business. How can U.S. policymakers better prepare themselves for corruption nuance in foreign policy development?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, inherently with nuance, it's really tough to decode. The only thing that I would say that policymakers can do is not exacerbate it. Oftentimes you see in US policy is once they see their avenues for either patronage or cultural things that are just part of doing business, they accelerate it and they exacerbate it because they know that they can facilitate their interests so much quicker by just piling on. And you see this a lot in developing countries and the interaction between economic policy and even trade policy. So there's no real answer to how you can work around the nuance because every cultural community and systems are different. But I would just say to guard against accelerating it and taking advantage of it for your own interest, because that's acting corruptly and that's just betraying the cultural spirit of whatever it is that's happening. Now, if that question is more to the fact that they know it's negative and it's still occurring, I think I'd give the same answer. But it's hard to do business and be in the frame of business, the frame of mind to profit and not see these avenues and take advantage of them. Those two things might inherently be at odds with each other. But it's a very, very difficult question. The key is nuance, and it's very hard to catch nuance, especially when you're dealing in so many different contexts.
Great. Okay, we have 3 other questions so far, so there's a lot of interest, a lot of engagement, which is great. Short question. In the developing world, are there government structures which can reduce corruption?
Sorry, let me see that again.
In the developing world, are there governmental structures which can reduce corruption?
Ideally, yes. Unfortunately, if they're in the context and the institutional systems that are plagued by abusive behavior, they end up being counterproductive. For example, in Nigeria, they have so many bodies to improve transparency and guard against corruption or money laundering or any type of abuse of power. And unfortunately, these same institutions oftentimes become hubs to perpetrate the exact thing in which they're supposed to guard against. So you put together a body to guard against corruption in a corrupt state, and that body now becomes corrupted, that it's facilitating more corruption, if that makes sense. So the idea is sound, it's just the execution takes a bit of awareness. It probably takes a bit of external participation as well. But certainly there's things that you can do. There's certainly policies that you can raise, but it's so hard to remove behavior that's so ingrained, especially when there are new avenues to behave that way. If it's a brand new administration, a brand new parastatal, a brand new fill in the blank institution that has never been seen before and has not been defined, then invariably you'll get people or modes of behavior that take advantage of that. So even when they're designed to guard against corruption, sometimes you see that they actually help produce and proliferate corruption.
Okay, thank you. I just, I see a note here from Matthew Oxford in the department who mentions that one of our faculty members has his hand up. So we're gonna try to allow him to talk because I think he has an intervention on your point here. So okay. Matt, if that's possible. Okay, hi, welcome, and feel free to introduce yourself and join in on the discussion, and then we'll go to the other question that we have. Thank you. Okay, might be muted. I'm not sure. Okay, there you are. Okay, we hear you.
Okay. Hello, Nnamdi. Very good talk. Pleased to meet you. Again, I think my question was about your answer or your take about corrupt. No country that has developed without bouts of corruption in their history. And so it reminded me of Gunnar Myrdal and his studies of Southeast Asian countries in the 1950s and 60s, in which he argued that corruption could lead to development. And so got me thinking, is there a difference in your take on and how you're framing corruption and what Gunnar Myrdal talked about in the 1950s and 60s, in which he argued that with modernization, corruption tends to decline. So is there a difference in what he said and what you're describing here?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for jumping in. The difference that I would point out comes in terms of time and moments. I don't disagree with Gunnar in that corruption can actually lead to development and decline with modernization, but when are you assessing that moment of development, right? So if you go back to the modernization work of Lipset and others who talked about the takeoff, right? The 5 stages of development where countries will basically have to copy and Xerox the technological advances and the industrial moments of other countries to then incorporate themselves into a modern world economy. Now, Samuel Huntington also said that with modernization, it's part and parcel that you will have corruption. There is no doubt about that. You will have instability in politics and institutions. I agree with both. I don't think that there's a difference in terms of my postulation and Gunnar's. I just think it's the time that you're looking at. So if you look at Nigeria in the 1960s or 1970s, after this modernization was supposed to occur and take off, you can say, well, corruption and no development. But then if you look at Japan, as I mentioned, in the 1990s, in East Asia where he studied, you see these Asian tigers and you see corruption and development. You know, even the United States, corruption in the 19th century, but then development. So it's about timing. I think epoch matters greatly when you're assessing these different contestations and these different conceptualizations of corruption. And that was part of my point, is always be very, very cognizant of time and space, because a shift in one can certainly shift your understanding of corruption.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nnamdi. We have one more question. Maybe we'll have another afterwards, but we just have about 4 minutes, so that might be our last question. The person is thanking you for your presentation and asking, this relates to domestic educational policy, and the head of the Department of Education, Betsy DeVos, has been very publicly pro-school choice, promoting charter schools above public schools, and has been pretty vocal about her push to privatize education. Given her history in pushing pro-school choice and charter schools prior to her position as Department of Education head, could this be considered special interest corruption, pork barrel spending? So this is along the lines of a certain former head of Halliburton who happened to become vice president.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I won't pretend to be an expert in this specific topic about the school education, but I will say it's parallel in many ways to the type of corruption, special interest corruption, pork barrel spending, clientelism, if you will, that occurs throughout different institutions in politics. I gave the Halliburton example. This can be easily another example. I think the important thing to remember is when you're dealing with these institutions and these bodies, and you have capital at stake, their action really will tell you their incentive, right? So if people are being awarded or given positions just based on relationships and not really based on merit, or decisions are being made based on the bottom line and the financial or fiduciary outcome, and not really based on the other intended purpose, then you have to start asking real questions. And I do believe that those are modes of corruption that occur institutionally. And we'll get into more about how the pandemic has led to these shifts in part 3. So again, just plugging my other talks, but in part 3, we'll really get into the institutional transformation of how the pandemic specifically has caused certain institutions to shift in those modes of behavior. But to that topic, yes, I would classify that as, I don't know that they would call it pork barrel spending, but the parallel is certainly there to where your interest is cloaked in, or not, some cases not necessarily even cloaked, but is incorporated in the action that is supposed to serve a greater good, but is really serving a more specific good.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. I think this relates to Nigeria. There is currently an End SARS movement ongoing in Nigeria, where Nigerians have been peacefully demonstrating for police reform and seeking to end corruption in their democracy. Unfortunately, it was reported that some peaceful protesters were killed by some military forces while demonstrating. These atrocities leave Nigerians feeling somewhat hopeless about a brighter future for all. What role do you think corruption will have in Nigeria in the next 50 years? So this is very specific toward the start of your story, Nigeria.
Yeah, I love this question. I mean, I'll start by saying that the role corruption has played in Nigeria over the last 50 years has been immense. There's no reason to believe that it won't continue to play a very strong role. I will get into the NSARS discussion and the institutional ramifications also in talk 3. Nigeria is actually one of the case studies that I use to show how the pandemic has really erupted and shown a change in institutional abuses of power and the uprisings that have been a consequence of that. So that is really on my agenda for talk 3. I just don't want to, again, give too much away, and I'll talk about all these things in 2 and 3, but corruption is going to be a meaningful part of Nigeria's growth, as it has been in their development to date. And it really has been across the world when you talk about political and economic development.
Okay, wonderful, Nnamdi. It's 5:30. We've had a lot of great questions, really, really interesting answers. I want to thank you for a really engaging and talk and Q&A session. Thank you all for attending. And just to remind you, the second talk is November 10th from 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. There'll be an email sent out. These talks are open to the public, so feel free to bring your friends. And virtually that is, so November 10th at 4:30 p.m. by Zoom, followed by the third talk, November 18th at 3 p.m. by Zoom. Thank you all very much, and see you in a couple of weeks after Election Day. Don't forget to vote. Thanks so much, Nnamdi.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, take care, bye-bye.